Hi, and welcome to another tutorial on PHP. In this tutorial, we'll be learning how to use for loops in PHP. And for loops are something that's really useful in programming. We can use for loops basically as a counted loop, so to repeat a section of code a certain number of times. So we can use it as a counted loop to repeat instructions. We can also use for loops to loop through items in an array or a list. So to go through an array of different items and perform an operation on each item one at a time. Um, and we can also use it for string operations. So maybe to check each individual letter in a string or a word and go through each letter one by one and do something with that. So there are many different uses for loops. So we can use for loops for arrays and string operations, but we won't be doing that today. Today we'll just look at how to use for loops as a counted loop. Okay, so we'll look at string operations and using for loops and arrays in future tutorials. But today we'll just look at using for loops with a counter. Okay, so to create a for loop, the syntax is basically we start with the word for, and then in brackets we have three expressions, and each one is separated by semicolons. So we've got firstly the initialization, okay, then we have a semicolon, and then after that is the condition, another semicolon, and lastly, the third expression is the afterthought. Okay, so we'll come back to that in just a sec. After we close off that bracket, we then use curly brackets, and inside the curly brackets, that's where the code goes. So while the for loop is running, whatever code is going to run during that loop, so for each repetition of that loop, the code that code will basically go in here. Okay, so we've got firstly initialization. So that's where we might use a counter. So we create a variable that's going to be used as a counter. So to start with, we need to create a variable $I. Okay, and I just standing for iteration. So we're going to set I to 0. All right, so that's our initialization or our counter there. So we've got I equals 0, a variable that will be used in this for loop. It's initially set to 0. Now what we might do is we might just display a message on the screen. We might have an echo statement, and we might do that, say, 5 times. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll set I to 0, and then the condition will be while I is less than 5. Okay, so we can put $I less than 5. So that's our condition. All right, and then after that, after the next semicolon, we can put what will happen at the end of this iteration of the loop. All right, so we might increase I by a value of 1. So we'll increment. So we've got I plus plus. All right, so basically what's going on here, we've got the initialization. So we've got a counter here called I, and that's initially set to 0. So that's its initial value, 0. Okay. The condition for this for loop to run is that I has to be less than 5. All right. So at the beginning, I is 0. All right. So the loop will run once, and then I will increase by 1 here. So after the loop runs, after one iteration of the loop, I becomes 1. All right. So I plus plus, I becomes 1. Then again, the loop will check if I is less than 5. It's 1, which is less than 5. So the code inside the loop will run again, and then I will become 2. All right, and so on. So the code will, inside this loop, inside the curly brackets, will keep running until I becomes 5. So it'll only run while I is less than 5. All right, so eventually I will become 5, and then the loop will stop running. All right, so the code that we can put inside here, and we can actually use this I variable inside the loop, but we could say something like echo, and then we could say in brackets and just a string, we could say this is iteration number, and then so what we can say is this is iteration number 0, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and then the loop should stop. All right, so we can have a string there, and then we can put a period there to basically add on or concatenate this string with the value of I. So we can put $I. All right, and then we can just end that line there with the semicolon. Okay, so we should have iteration. This is iteration number, and then it should say each iteration. So remember that I is initially 0, and then it will become 1. So the next time the loop runs, it will be, this is iteration number 1. Then when the loop runs again, it will increase again. So it will become iteration number 2, number 3, and so on. All right, so let's save that and run this in Chrome. So we'll refresh the page. And oops, I've got made a little mistake there. I forgot to put $sign in front of this variable here. Okay, so go back and refresh. That should be fixed. All right, so I've got, this is iteration number 0. This is iteration number 1. This is iteration number 2. This is iteration number 3. And this is iteration number 4. Okay, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 iterations of that loop, starting from 0 up to 4. All right, what we could also do is we could add another period here, and then we could add another string, but this time we'll use some HTML. We'll use the line break tag. So we refresh that. We'll put each of these statements onto a different line. All right. Now we're using I++. What we could also do is we could use I minus minus if we want it to go down by 1 each time. And we could then say, instead of having while I is less than 5, we could have while I is greater than 5 instead. Okay, and then we could make I 10. We could set it initially as a variable of 10, all right? So we could save and refresh, and then we've got, this is iteration number 10, so that's where the loop starts, and it becomes 9, 8, 7, 6, and it stops when it's no longer greater than 5, all right? So that's basically how to use a for loop with a counter. In the next tutorial, we'll be looking at while loops. And then later on, we'll come back to for loops and we'll look at how to use them with arrays and string operations. All right, so that's all for this tutorial. Thanks for watching.